Okay, so I'm going to begin by introducing this event and why it's called what it's called and what we're trying to achieve with this event. So my name is Elaine Quarry. I'm the Women's Sector Lobbyist at the Women's Resource and Development Agency. And the Women's Sector Lobbyist is the chair of the Women's Policy Group. The Women's Policy Group is a collection, really a fairly ad hoc collection of women working in policy roles across the women's sector, the LGBTQ sector, trade unions, human rights organizations, and just interested individuals generally. And we come together to look at policy issues that affect women in Northern Ireland. Or a membership group as well. So by all means, if you're interested in joining, you can get in touch and we can make that happen. The goal of our work overall is advocating for the women of Northern Ireland. And the reason that hate crime has been a particular area of work for us over the last couple of years, and I'm going back maybe 3 or 4 years, is because of the hate crime review that was announced, but also because of the ongoing questions about what do you do about hate that is targeting women specifically, and is making misogyny a category of hate crime the right route to go? Is there a better route to go? What happens if you just do a gender neutral approach? And we've worked hard on this internally and externally to try and reach an agreed position and to try and advocate for the changes that need to be made. What we're all agreed on one way or the other is that it is a problem and that we need to think about it. But, and this is the reason for this event, what has become very clear is there's a little bit of confusion and I suppose misinformation out there about the idea of hate crime. And people sometimes even use the expression almost as a joke. And so what we wanted to do today was talk about what hate crime actually means, what the law on it currently is, how it's proposed, how proposed changes are coming in, and what those will mean. And this is both Northern Ireland specific and not Northern Ireland specific. So it's even just a concept of hate crime. And we're going to explore that with an expert speaker in a moment. And then we're going to hear from speakers who are involved in the hate crime advocacy project here in Northern Ireland. So that's the coordinator who works at victim support, and then those representatives who work with various organizations working closely with people who experience hate crime under a particular category. And we're going to talk about the impact of hate crime and the importance of their work. So I'm going to stop speaking now and hand over to our first speaker, who's going to give us the background and context of hate crime. And that's Daniel Holder. Daniel is the Deputy Director at CAJ, the Campaign and the Administration of Justice. This is an organization focused on human rights as a whole, and with particular focus on individual issues. Hate crime is something that CAJ have worked on a lot over the years, and I'm going back much more than 4 or 5 years at this stage. And so we're going to get some context and background from Daniel. Thank you, Daniel.
Okay, look, thanks very much. Thanks for the invite. So I suppose let's think about this concept of hate crimes. And quite often what we're talking about in terms of law and offences is two separate things that often get a bit confused and conflated, two different sets of offences. Now, what they do have in common is they're all about combating crimes that are driven by ideologies of hatred, ideologies of contempt or supremacism against protected groups, so against the groups that you'd find in equality legislation. A lot of the hate crime stuff started with racism, which would by extension include sectarianism, but it has been extended in a lot of places to other equality categories. It's been extended to sexual orientation, to combat homophobia, and obviously there's the discussion about the best way of extending it to misogyny as well as other protected characteristics. So all of those things have their own nuances, but they're all driven by an ideology. And I think the difference is they're about an attack on a whole community or group. It's not about the issue of vulnerability. That's always dealt with separately as an aggravating factor in the criminal law. If someone assaults, say, an elderly person, vulnerable person, they would look to get it. They would probably get a much more severe sentence anyway. That's not what this is about. This is about the additional harms of actually terrifying and targeting an entire community. So look, intimidating someone from their home for an individual reason is pretty bad. But racist intimidation would strike an entire climate of fear into a whole community. And it's much worse. It sends a signal around the community. That's why sometimes this is called signal crime. There are additional harms, and therefore the recognition is you need an additional legal framework to deal with that. We have some of that in place. We don't actually have what, strictly speaking, is often called hate crimes law in Northern Ireland, but there was a hate crimes review report at the end of December 2020. There's a lot of information in it, and it promotes a new model. It also highlights how vulnerable different groups are. Sectarianism is pretty bad, but you have a chance of 1 in 1,500 of being a victim of a sectarian crime. Given the relative size of communities, it's down to 1 in 31 if you're a victim of racism. But given a lot of the discussion we had on Monday about misogyny, clearly the figure for that seems to be roughly around 100%. Again, an area, a need for protection, but I'd said it's two things, and it is two things. It's two sets of offences. The second set is what's traditionally sort of called hate crimes legislation. But the other thing that's often mixed up in it is what we'd call incitement to hatred legislation. Now, what incitement to hatred legislation is about is it's about the worst sort of forms of what's often called hate speech. Now, hate speech is a term that's been around for ages. It's a little bit misleading nowadays because a lot of hate speech is actually not spoken. It's written down, particularly online. So we've started to use the hate expression as a concept, but we're essentially talking about the same thing. We're talking about racist stuff, sectarian stuff, transphobic stuff, homophobic stuff, etc. But we're not talking about all of it. We're talking about the worst forms of it. And just to give you what the legal parameters are, this worst form of hate speech has to either be intended or reasonably expected to lead to inciting acts of violence, intimidation, hostility, or discrimination against the group that it's targeted at. It has to be speech that's done in some sort of public context that could be in the street, but also could be online. Why is this a high threshold? Because it's the only form of speech that's actually made a criminal offense. So this would actually make that the worst forms of racist, homophobic speech a criminal offense, a crime you can actually be convicted of. And that's quite different. It doesn't actually criminalize everything that's racist. For example, a lot of racist stuff is pretty unpleasant, but doesn't reach a criminal threshold that you can be convicted for. There's a lot of other stuff that's just plain offensive, but isn't necessarily racist, and this doesn't go anywhere near that. There's been huge discussions about where the boundary of free expression begins and ends. That's a lot more developed now in human rights law, and it works differently in different jurisdictions. Countries that were occupied by the Nazis, including obviously Germany, have a very strong sense of incitement to hatred laws because the dangers and damages of inciting, and this was originally in the racism sphere, ethnic division and fueling war and fueling conflict and fueling oppression, are well known in the United States, and disastrous over the last 5 years, takes a very different approach where a much higher threshold is sort of set for intervention. Clearly, there's been huge amounts of incitement to hatred here over the years, huge amounts of things that on sectarian and other grounds would hit that threshold. We've actually had an incitement to hatred law since 1970. Here, it was entirely ineffective. It required a proof of intent, which is almost impossible to prove. That was remedied in the 1980s. There were still very, very few convictions. In 2004, it moved beyond racism and sectarianism, and two other protected grounds were added, which is sexual orientation and disability. We're added at that stage. Obviously, now we're talking about an extension of that, including to misogynistic incitement to hatred, particularly with the discourse of the incel movement and other sort of figures on the misogynistic figures on the far right. So I suppose the point I'm making is this is incitement to hatred legislation. It's part of the hate crimes and tackling hatred piece, but it's not actually hate crimes legislation. It's something separate. So what is hate crimes legislation? When you actually get public discourse about hate crimes legislation, you get a lot of opponents of hate crimes legislation gurning about free speech and how it's going to impact on free speech. That is totally misleading. Hate crimes legislation is not actually about speech, and it's also entirely about things that are already crimes. It doesn't involve creating any new crimes as such. So give an example. Punching someone in the face is a crime. It's called assault. That's a basic offense. But if you punch someone in the face because of a racist motivation, that thing can then become a hate crime because it's a racist assault. Graffiti is a crime. It's criminal damage. I know some of it's quite expressive art and probably shouldn't be, but it usually is criminal damage. But homophobic graffiti is different. It's an existing crime, but with a homophobic element. So it therefore becomes homophobic criminal damage. So the whole thing of hate crimes is about existing actual crime, not new offenses at all. It's not about speech, save obviously for the narrow number of criminal offenses where something you say could be a crime, like if you threaten to kill someone, for example, then there's obviously a speech element to that. Hate crimes laws can cover all offenses, all criminal offenses or crimes, or just some of them. There are different models of around. So I can use my freedom of expression to say that the groups that oppose hate crimes legislation that say it will damage free speech are talking absolute nonsense, because that simply is not what hate crimes legislation does. There is the issue of incitement to hatred legislation, but we actually already have that, and we've had it for about 50 years. We're just looking at a much better model now. In terms of the hate crimes law, there's two basic models. I think the easiest way going through this is to actually just remind ourselves of what happens in the criminal justice system when it works properly. You've different stages before someone is sanctioned, is fined, or is sent to prison or whatever else for committing a crime. So you have a stage of investigation, which is conducted by the police, where they will investigate the offence. They'll gather evidence about the offence. Then they hand a file to stage 2, which is the prosecution service. They will take the evidence for the police, and they will prepare a case to go to court to actually place the evidence against the accused person so that they can be prosecuted. Then you have a trial where you have a judge, or in some instances a jury for more serious offences, to consider the evidence and decide whether the person is guilty or not guilty. And then finally, stage 4 is you have the sentencing stage, where the judge will pass a sentence. So what hate crimes legislation about is increasing the prison sentence, because it's the offence was a hate crime rather than a basic crime. There are two models of that. The current one we have is an aggravated sentences model. Now, basically, what that does is it only comes in at that 4th stage that I just mentioned, the sentencing stage at the very end, where a judge at the end of the trial, she will say, right, we've convicted you of an assault, but the assault was aggravated by, say, racist hostility, and therefore I'm giving you a longer sentence. And it happens at the sentencing stage. Now, this model hasn't worked particularly well. And one of the reasons why it hasn't worked particularly well, I mean, there could be a big problem with, say, bits of levels of institutional racism, sectarianism, misogyny, whatever, within the criminal justice system. That could be one reason why it hasn't worked well. But there are other technical reasons as well. Basically, if you're an investigator or a prosecutor trying to convict someone of, say, an assault, ultimately what happens by default is that's all you gather evidence on. So there's actually not that much to go on by the time you get to the end of the process, because no one has actually, investigating and prosecuting is quite a detailed job, and you'll do the particular crime in question. So the other issue around that, so we have aggravated sentences legislation. We've had it since 2004 on those 4 grounds. So race, religion, sexual orientation, and disability. And it isn't really working that well. So there's an alternative model which is now being proposed by the Hate Crimes Review, which is what's called an aggravated offences as hate crimes model. So you no longer just have an assault, you actually have a crime of homophobic assault, for example. And therefore, the police are not just investigating an assault, but they're investigating a homophobic assault. So they should be gathering the evidence about the homophobia as part of the crime. And so should the prosecutor. They should also be trying to convict the person of not just an assault, but homophobic assault, and should gather evidence on that ground and present it before the actual trial, rather than leaving it to the final stage, which is the sentencing stage. And for the avoidance of doubt, a person can still be convicted of what you'd call the basic offence, like an assault, but not the homophobic assault, if the evidence is only proved on one of the grounds and not both. Because otherwise the worry would be it was actually, hate crimes legislation was actually going to make it more difficult to convict perpetrators than it already otherwise was. So the way the evidence is gathered, there are normally 2 thresholds in hate crimes legislation, and that's the case at the moment and would be with either of these models. One is if there's evidence of motivation. So, for example, there's an assault, and then the police search the suspect's house and find a whole load of sort of far-right literature, or a whole pile of stuff on social media that proves they're a misogynist, etc. And then you have evidence in the context of the crime of the potential for that to have been motivated by that ideology of hate. The other way this can be done in a legal sense is if the perpetrator, the suspect, demonstrates hostility at the time of the assault, so or whatever crime it is. So before they stab someone, they shout a whole string of sectarian or racist abuse at the person. That's the other way of proving that this was a hate crime rather than just a basic offence. So they're the 2 models. That's what the Hate Crimes Review is proposing in terms of where this goes now. It is proposing extending protected characteristics as well. It's left some like age open, which is a sort of different matter. It is proposing to extend a new category, transgender identity. And it has left open the discussion on how to best protect against misogyny. Is it just adding sex as a protected characteristic and then linking it to misogynistic abuse? That was one of the original proposals. There's then been a bit of a pushback against that from opponents pushing for this sort of gender neutral approach, using gender as a sort of social construct, but the express reason for being it is that to ensure the offence also equally protects men from something called misandry. That's rather an irrational approach because it doesn't exist. So that's kind of a flat earth argument, but it's irritating to see it continuously popping up and being continuously used as a way to undermine a much more tailored set of protections. The hate crimes legislation proposes tailored protections for several areas. So there will be a sectarianism aggravator, for example, is proposed, so a very specific model to deal with the nuances of sectarianism. And when we had further discussion on this and the event, Lane, you were involved in on Monday with Helena Kennedy, she has come up with a sort of blueprint of how you could better protect against misogyny within the rubric of hate crimes legislation, not necessarily within the same bill. It could be a separate sort of misogyny act to give it even more clear, to send an even clearer message. But it would be a provision whereby you actually have an aggravator based on misogyny. And a bit like the sectarianism aggravator, you actually have incitement to hatred, misogyny being a ground, and you also have some very specific offences around public misogynistic harassment and issuing threats or invoking threats of rape, sexual assault, disfigurement, women and girls, etc. So there's a kind of an alternative model that's actually tailored to the nuances of misogyny that would provide a particular blueprint for a way forward. Obviously, all of this is still open to discussion. We don't have an assembly at the moment, or even a justice minister, let alone a piece of legislation that's ready to go. But that's the basic sort of outline of what hate crimes is and what the different models are. Sinead.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That's just a really excellent overview with just the right sort of amount of detail and where we are right now. The changing model will, of course, be really, really helpful. And I'm hoping now that we can move into as we move into the sort of second part, we're going to hear directly from those advocates who are working in the communities across Northern Ireland with people who've experienced hate crime and the importance of their work and the special impact that you mentioned, Daniel, in your presentation about the unique impact, the fear and so forth that comes along with hate crime as distinct from many other types of crime, and the fear that spreads and ripples through the whole community, including people who weren't direct victims. So I'm going to pass over now to Michael Avila. Michael is the coordinator based at Victim Support Northern Ireland, the coordinator of the hate crime advocates as a whole. So Michael, I believe you have a presentation. Do you have permission to share the screen, or do I need to give you that? You have. Excellent.
I've got it here. Yeah, can everybody see that okay? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Michael.
No problem. Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Daniel. Obviously, Daniel excellently went over kind of the more at the policy and legislative aspect of hate crime there. I'm happy to comment on that from an advocacy point of view as well. But yeah, I'm here with some of my colleagues tonight as well, so I'll be introducing them throughout my presentation too. But yes, my name is Michael Avila. I run the Hate Crime Advocacy Service based in victim support, but we work in equal partnership with our consortium partners, which again I'll get into. As manager of the Hate Crime Advocacy Service, we work to address hate and signal crimes across Northern Ireland today. You heard Daniel there also referred to the term signal crimes, which I'll get into as well. But yeah, so before we get into our services, you probably all have somewhat of an idea of what hate crime looks like in your head. But before we get into exactly what we do, I think it's firstly important to define exactly what a hate crime is and understand a bit more of its impact on victims. So what exactly is a hate crime? You've got kind of more of the technical definition there on screen, but essentially a hate crime is when a person is targeted for their identity, which can involve their religion, ethnic or racial background, sexual orientation, gender identity, or for having a disability. And it is possible that those protected characteristics, as Daniel laid out, may be extended if and when we get this legislation hopefully passed at some point. Yeah, the more confusing definition there may be signal crime. So the way I would describe a signal crime, well, firstly, a signal crime are message crimes that signal that a community of which the victim is a member of may not be accepted. Really, I look at signal crimes as a hate crime on steroids. It's kind of more at the macro level or more at the communal level, whereas a hate crime may be more directed towards an individual. Signal crimes are usually sent towards whole communities. I think a really good and recent example of this is the 2 arson attacks on the Belfast Multicultural Association, which occurred in the last maybe year and a half. Sending a direct message to that community that they're not welcome on the Donegal Pass. But also, so signal crimes not only just sending a message to that community that they're not welcome, but it's also sending a signal to other potential perpetrators throughout society, whether that be in Northern Ireland or throughout the UK, to potentially commit similar crimes to similar communities. Another good example of this is maybe in a shared housing estate locally, a group of families are intimidated out of their homes. That can also be seen as a signal crime, as well as in the past, we've seen attacks on the Belfast Synagogue, on the Belfast Islamic Center, or towards members of a particular religion or cultural background. So yeah, it is more communal versus the individual, but both of them obviously involve hate, and they are two things that we address as part of the Hate Crime Advocacy Service. I'm going to go through this quite quickly. Usually play some videos here, but I do want to get more to the discussion end of things. So yes, there are 6 strands of hate crime in Northern Ireland. They include disability, racial hate crime, homophobia, transphobia, faith/religious hate crime, and sectarianism. And I'll get into these different strands as we go through. But yeah, I think it's now that you've got a little bit more of an idea of the different aspects of hate crime, the different protected characteristics, let's get into our services now. So the Hate Crime Advocacy Service has been around since 2008 and with victim support since 2013, and it's funded by the PSNI and the Department of Justice. It aims to improve support to victims, increase confidence, and encourage reporting, as well as improve access to the criminal justice system. Victim Support acts as coordinator, but we work in equal partnership with the Migrant Center for Northern Ireland. My colleague Nikki Yao is here with us tonight. She's the racial advocate for the Foyle region. We've got Leonard Cheshire and Rebecca Waz with us tonight from Leonard Cheshire, who will address all disability hate crime referrals within the service. And we've got Aisling Playford from the Rainbow Project, who will deal with all homophobic and transphobic hate crime referrals. And then Victim Support also will take on religious and sectarian referrals as well. Examples of good practice and learning are then shared across the partnership. We currently, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we have 4 advocates at the moment that deal with hate crime across Northern Ireland, and our role is to contact each victim and help signpost them to other services, whether that be legal advice, housing issues, health, or psychological support. Obviously, our main remit is investigative support and helping victims through the investigative process, whether that is following up with police or passing on evidence, helping them report, and giving key information on the criminal justice system. And then also sometimes we will refer to other victim support or other community services within victim support. We have our emotional support services, as well as criminal injury compensation. And of course, each partner organization has their own services as well, whether that be mental health counseling or otherwise. The advocates meet with the police and Department of Justice each month to review the previous month's advocacy and engagement and to identify any rising trends over that period. This update then allows police to fast track areas of concern and adapt policing in local areas to address and monitor these issues. So we work obviously very closely with investigating officers as well as neighborhood policing teams and crime prevention in the wake of crimes as well. So how can the advocates help? So I talked about our investigative support. That's our main remit, as well as third-party reporting to the PSNI, our signposting to other services. We also provide post-investigative support at times if a client is unhappy with the criminal justice process or with the police. We can file a police ombudsman's complaint for them. We can also liaise with their GPs should they need any mental health or counseling or have any injuries after a crime. We spend a lot of time on rehousing. A lot of hate crime is tied to the home, and a lot of it occurs within social housing. So that's probably spend just as much amount of time on that as we do on the investigative support and helping. The quickest way to get someone away from especially repeat victimization is by getting them rehoused. And then a lot of what we do is awareness raising and building partnerships through hosting presentations like this and liaising with other community and statutory organizations. So how does our system work? Victim support should be receiving all referrals directly from police, and then they'll be triaged and then sent on to the correct hate crime advocate. It's important to remember that victims can self-refer or be referred by third-party organizations. So if you work with any organizations and you are aware of hate crime issues or particular victim issues, please signpost them to us. We're happy to reach out to them. That does mean, obviously, we encourage victims to report to police as often as possible, whether that's a hate crime or even incidents that don't reach that crime threshold. I'm happy to get into that a bit later as well. But we do know that there's times where it may not be advisable for victims to report to police. So we're obviously can still provide all services anonymously as well. So I do want to dive back into the different strands. I think it's important for people to understand some of the nuances within hate crime. So with disability hate crime, there's many barriers. This can include communication issues, mobility, access to transport. A lot of this often results in further isolation, which can compound either already existing or create mental health issues. Especially, you can imagine, being a victim of a hate crime can be extremely traumatizing. This is one of the things we saw over the pandemic. We all probably felt isolated at times. You can imagine how much more so that is for people with disabilities who are being intimidated in their homes. So this is an issue that we come up with a lot, and we do advise people, if they are working with people with disabilities, to be aware of this. Maybe their disabilities are apparent, maybe they're not, but in addition to that, there may be that mental health side of things as well, especially if they have been victims. So it's something to be aware of. With disability hate crime, I'd say we make sure to continually follow up with victims as often as possible to make sure they're doing okay and are getting the support services that they need, as things can change rapidly day to day, and our partners at Leonard Cheshire have a long tenure of providing those services. So some of the issues and considerations for LGBT hate crime. So discrimination in this category can be rampant. That can come from within their own family, from within their own community, from across communities, or from the wider public. They're often targeted for their sexual orientation or gender identity. Hate speech, as Daniel talked about earlier, is quite common in this category, as well as verbal abuse and public harassment. One of the big issues we've seen recently that is actually starting to reemerge again, unfortunately, is street preachers in the corn market areas of Belfast and sometimes in other towns throughout Northern Ireland. Has often caused a lot of antisocial behavior and some issues there. So that's always a kind of a freedom of speech versus versus a hate speech issue. What's frustrating in this category and really across the strands is there's often no outcome or consequence for perpetrators. The threshold for proving a hate crime is quite high. So if you don't have that CCTV evidence or key eyewitness accounts or some audio footage, it can be very difficult to prove that a hate motivated crime happened. And it often ends up being the word of the perpetrator versus the word of the victim, which is unfortunately often not enough to convict. Online hate speech has also risen quite a bit during and after the pandemic. And I think it's important in this category to put yourself in the victim's shoes. It's never easy to deal with many of these issues in normal times, but infinitely more difficult when you are targeted for your identity. Luckily, our LGBT advocates and partners in the Rainbow Project provide excellent specialist services from a very empathetic point of view and are well capable of supporting victims through the investigative process and providing them the necessary support. So some of the issues for religious and sectarian hate crimes. So there is a distinction here. Both the police and us, obviously, as advocates, will make this distinction. We don't get a ton of religious referrals. Obviously, we do get quite a bit of sectarian in Northern Ireland. But the key difference is religious, again, a lot of those are tied to signal crimes usually. So if someone is attacked for wearing a particular religious or cultural dress, if a place of worship is attacked, basically, if it is kind of someone strictly being targeted for religious affiliation, that's kind of more on the religious side. Sectarian has to do more with the traditional conflict in Northern Ireland. It is more communal. Obviously, there is maybe a religious aspect to it, but it is definitely about the two majority communities, if you will, in Northern Ireland. Now, saying that doesn't mean that people from other backgrounds can't be victims of sectarian hate crime. A lot of children, particularly from minority ethnic backgrounds, have been targeted with sectarian hate crime because they'll be wearing, a Catholic or Protestant school uniform, or be residing in an area, or maybe have a partner that's from a certain background. So it is more convoluted, and there's a lot of intersectionality, of course. At any rate, both categories, there's a lot of fear and intimidation, as well as the threat of escalating violence, which often results in an unwillingness to report and further lack of support. I would say sectarian hate crime has actually gone down over the last 20, 25 years since the agreement, which is obviously good to see. And, it's kind of one of those positive aspects of the peace process and society moving forward. At the same time, we do think it's one of the more underreported categories, as a lot of people kind of think, probably because of the embedded normalization of sectarianism in Northern Ireland plays a role in that. And also, I think there is probably a frustration at times in people that, especially repeat victims, who have come forward and maybe haven't gotten the results they wanted in the courts. So, and of course, Northern Ireland becoming vastly more diverse. We've seen that kind of in this last census. Religious hate crimes tied in with racial hate crimes have been on the rise as well. So last but not least, some of the issues and considerations for racial hate crime. So when it comes to racial hate crime, there are many barriers, including language and cultural barriers. It's important to realize that many migrants have already come from marginalized backgrounds in their home countries, especially refugees and asylum seekers. And that's precisely why many of them are here. They're often then further marginalized upon arrival, depending on how they're accepted into different communities. Like other hate crimes, their cases rarely reach court, as there often isn't enough evidence to prosecute. A lot of these issues may then end up in community resolutions utilizing restorative practices like mediation, for example. Victim support, and I would dare say that the rest of our partners within the Hate Crime Advocacy Service would be huge proponents of restorative practices. But I should also say that we're very, very lucky in this part of the world. Things like mediation and restorative practices don't exist all places. And to be fair, going back to the language and cultural barriers, the term hate crime may not translate into all languages. It may not be legislated in all countries. So we are going up kind of against a barrier of knowledge or being introduced to exactly what hate crime is. So that's why it's necessary to always speak clearly, use interpretive services where necessary to make sure that everything is fully understood, and most importantly, listen intently. Along with sectarianism, racial hate crime tends to have some of the highest levels and most extreme cases of violence and vandalism, and is rising at the moment. That 1 in 31 number that Daniel had said earlier, I'm not surprised by that at all, considering that there's an embedded sectarian issue in Northern Ireland, and that racial hate crimes still usually outnumber sectarian hate crimes on a yearly basis, is saying something when there's only about a 3% foreign-born population. So we know it's a small population that is targeted at a high rate, and there's a lot of repeat victimization. So yeah, to end on a more positive note, I do want to say that empathy can often overcome many of these language and cultural barriers. Lending a helpful ear and hand can go a long way to reassure victims that we have their best interest at hand and are willing and able to get them the support they need. And our friends at the Migrant Center have a long tenure of providing such services. So I know I spoke very quickly there, and hopefully I didn't run over time. But yeah, that's the Hate Crime Advocacy Service. So I'll stop sharing here. And if you have any questions, please do reach out to us or in the question section, and I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was just really an excellent overview, and I kind of think it dovetailed and overlapped nicely with what Daniel was speaking about the legislative framework, but also the very practical framework of what you actually offer across Northern Ireland to people who are victims of hate crime. And I think sometimes people aren't aware of these things and they don't realize they can self-refer and so forth. And I know that the individual organizations involved do great work within their communities to try and publicize that, but I think it needs to be, more widely understood, and that's part of why we were holding an event like this. We have some of the individual hate crime advocates here on the call, so we're going to hear from some of them. Not all are available, but we have two, I believe. I think Aisling has to leave shortly. Her battery is dying. She's on public transport. So we're going to hear first from Nikki Yao. Nikki is based in the Northwest, the Foyle area, I believe. And Nikki's going to talk about her work with victims of racist hate crime. Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation as well. I'm based in the Northwest in Derry, and my partner Robert is actually based in Belfast down there, because race hate crime does have a large number of incidents and crimes. So we need to advocate to help out in the Northwest, in Northern Ireland. So we, as you say, we're from the Migrant Center, and I think since Britain voted Brexit, I think it really spiked up with the racial hate crime. A lot of people were telling European people to go back home and things like that. And now, so slowly, there is a lot of Europeans have gone back to their home because they just had enough of the grief what they're getting. And with racial hate crime, don't be afraid to report to the police. It's important to let the police know this is happening in your area. And I know sometimes you don't want to bother because it's a low case level, like knocking or kids throwing stones on your house. But that's what they wanted to know, to stop things to escalate, to get something or somebody get injured. So the more you report to them, they know they have not sorted out the problem in the area. So they can ask for more patrol, and don't be afraid to ask for the interpreting service, because the police can get somebody on the phone 24/7 using the interpreting service. Just use the interpreter if you can't speak English, because sometimes police can just say their English is okay, but the trouble is their English was very limited, so they try to use the word they know to tell what happened. But if they have an interpreter, they can tell a lot more what they really want to say, So it's really vital they ask for interpreting service. I also always say to the police, don't ask the children whether they think it's hate crime or not, because for example, like my son, he's been living here since he was 2. So to him, Northern Ireland is his home. And this house has always been his house So if somebody tell him to go back home, we don't want you here. So for him, oh, it's the house I just live in all my life. But for the parents, we know exactly what that means. Tell us to go back to our own country, you know. And children do not see themselves any different to their friends. And so it's really important that, you know, that if officer doesn't say that and let the parents decide whether this is a racial hate crime or not. I think a lot of time police officer doesn't understand how migrants feel, and they can be very sensitive, and sometimes they will look at it, oh, it's just a normal harassment with the neighbor, you know, it's nothing to do with race. But if you imagine if they haven't had any trouble with the neighbor next door and they are local, or the other house, which is a local family, but just you harassing you, and then they start shouting racial abuse and things like that, then it is, especially during the lockdown, when people have to confine in the house a lot of time, and some people just cannot tolerate noises, and they become very aggressive in a way, shouting to their neighbor, which is what we have a lot during the lockdown time. So all I can say is don't be afraid to ring the police or contact us, have a chat with us. We can tell you or suggest you what to do, and also report on your behalf if you don't want to report. But at the end of the day, the police will like to make a statement with you. And I always advise my client that if you want to see some justice, you have to make a statement and make a formal complaint against those people. So when they know who he is and found the perpetrator, they can prosecute them, you know, with information. And sometimes I know it's disheartening when it's those cases and they can't find the person who did it, or the CCTV is not really clear and they can't find the person. We just have to keep going, really. And I found it really useful now when people have CCTV with a voice recording, because the recording is so important sometimes, you know, even without the image, but you can hear them shouting away, making racial comments and things like that. So that is one of my big thing I tell to my client, to maybe invest on one of these. That's the main thing. And I normally address myself as a support worker, focus advocate. In Polish means some kind of solicitor. So I know I don't study law, so you know, and as Michael mentioned, some countries do not have hate crime, so they understand as bullying. So that's why, I mean, like in Japan, it's a fast country, but they don't have hate crime thing. They still call it as bullying. So it makes a lot of difference. That's it really, you know, because Michael have said it all as well.
Thank you so much, Nikki. And I as brilliant as Michael's presentation was, I don't think he did say it all, because one of the things that you have brought to life, for at least for me, is, you know, little practical things like the recording of somebody's what they're saying. It does so much for the police if they are going to prosecute a crime, to prove that racist motivation that Daniel was speaking about earlier, and how difficult it is to prove that. And if you have a person saying a string of racial insults or any other kind of hate motivated insults, you know, it's hard to argue against that. And I think also it's important that people understand, and we need to get it out there better, that there is an interpreter service that the police are obliged to provide for you, whatever it is that your native language is. They're obliged to get an interpreter for you. And I think sometimes people don't understand that, and so it can be very intimidating. So the work that you are doing to bring that knowledge and information to people is just so important. And thank you for your work, but also thank you for what you've just said.
Also, I'd like to mention Migrant Center, all workers are bilingual, and we do have interpreting service. So if anybody who speaks to us don't speak English, we can find an interpreter for them as well, you know.
That's so important as well, because sometimes people, you know, maybe they're not ready to talk to the police, but they want to have an in-depth conversation with somebody who can speak their own language. And thank you so much, Nikki, for that overview. It's really, really important. It does bring it to life. And we're going to move to Rebecca now. Rebecca's also going to bring to life the way in which her advocacy work, and I take your point as well, advocacy doesn't translate well outside of English, I think, but the way in which her advocacy work helps those people who experience hate crime motivated by disability. Rebecca works with Leonard Cheshire, who are a really long-standing and well-respected disability rights organisation here in Northern Ireland. So Rebecca, I'm going to pass over to you to speak a bit about your work. Thank you. Rebecca, I can't hear you, sorry. Okay.
Can you hear me any better there now? Yeah, the headphones aren't working, so I'll put them back. So yeah, my name's Rebecca. So I'm the disability hate crime advocate. So I work directly with Leonard Cheshire, but I'm part of the hate crime advocacy service. So I would support individuals who have been a victim of disability hate crime motivated because of their disability. So I just want to touch upon some of the kind of questions that you asked, Elaine, so just about why our work is important. I think the hate crime advocacy service is quite unique in itself because we do have all these counterparts that come from speciality services. So Nikki with the Migrant Centre NI, and then obviously with Leonard Cheshire and the Rainbow Project. So we all have our own kind of speciality that we can bring into the service and uniquely support those people through the process. But often what people will say to me is that, you know, it's really helpful having an advocate there that they can speak to, you know, navigating them through the criminal justice system, what the next stages are, you know, things that they may, and I mean, not everyone has ever had any experience with the criminal justice system. They may have never even spoke to a police officer before. So it's just kind of having that additional person and as a support network as well to speak to about it. And obviously that kind of emotional network, support network as well, which is really important because they've just experienced a very traumatic incident or crime or however you wish to phrase it. But, you know, that can be very, very traumatic, those initial stages, especially with having made a report to the police, kind of speaking with police officers, that can all be a very, very daunting process. So having us on board to try and support them through that, navigating through that, you know, what to expect, getting in, you know, liaising with the police officers if they need that, if there's any sort of housing issues of a direct link, because we know many individuals, particularly individuals with disability, are targeted at their home as well. So there can be kind of housing issues around that, supporting them with that, or getting in touch with any other agencies. So there may be some other organisations they may not be aware of that they could get support from, and that might be more surrounded around their specific disability. So if it's sensory, if it's maybe like deaf or blind services that they maybe have never been involved with, getting them involved with them. And I know Michael, I think, had mentioned this before, was around that isolation that people experience. And often people with disabilities do hugely experience that for a number of reasons. So us trying to being involved with themselves, linking in with the other agencies, linking in with the community, all of those things, and kind of bringing everything together. We're a little bit of like a link through all of that as well. And I think Michael had also mentioned there, but disability is probably one of the most underreported areas. You know, there's a number of reasons for that as well. You know, communication difficulties, accessibility, you know, cognition, understanding, you know, all of those different things. There's a number of things as well, and you know, a lot of fear and intimidation that might be experienced, and that's maybe why they don't want to come forward. And I think Nikki really well summed up there about the importance of reporting this to the police. It's so important that you're doing that and making that statement, as that will kind of support in terms of getting justice, you know, and the police then being aware of it and maybe getting neighbourhood teams involved and all of those things, crime prevention, all of that, and also then getting involved with ourselves, as the majority of our referrals come through the police. So then that, you know, that then allows us to get involved with ourselves as well. So yeah, and just want to touch upon then impact, that it has on individuals, particularly from a disability point of view. I don't think maybe people realise the impact that it really has on individuals when they experience a hate crime. Often again, going back to isolation, a lot of individuals already feel a level of isolation, that they may feel indifferent from other people in society. And when then they're being faced with hate, that obviously, escalates their own feelings that they may already have, which is then bringing in a lot of mental health issues, that isolation, maybe isolating themselves from the community because of what they're experiencing, feeling like outcasts in society, and feeling that they're being targeted because of their identity and who they are as a person, which is obviously not the case. But that then, whenever someone is a victim of hate crime, that's what allows that. There's a lot of paranoia around that as well. Is everybody thinking this about me? If someone has said something to them, it really does escalate things. And I think another thing about reporting to the police, Nikki again touched upon this, is that, it may be something quite, I don't want to say small because it's not small to that person, but as they maybe say, is like a minor incident, but it not maybe minor the impact it's had on that person. But from a policing maybe point of view, it's very important to know that these things can escalate very, very quickly. So it's so important that you're reporting everything to the police. I know there was a case many, many years ago, I think it was around 2005, and it was in England. I don't remember the names of the individuals, but it was a very kind of profoundly known case where it was a family who were being continuously targeted because of disability. Her 2 children had learning disabilities, and they ended up, the family took their own life because of what they were experiencing. There was a huge case review in that case around kind of feelings of police and different organisations as well. But it just emphasises how quickly something can escalate. It's so important to report it to the police, allow them to get involved. Let's get measures, let's get us involved to try and keep people safe and, allow things to work through the justice system as they solely should. So I think that's everything, Elaine.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I think that tragic example that you used there really does illustrate that quote unquote minor issues can have such a profound psychological impact when they are targeted at your identity and who you are, and the difference that will make to your experience, as opposed to being the victim of a random crime, which might actually on paper look like a more serious crime, but because it isn't targeted, because it isn't about who you are, it doesn't have quite the same impact. And I think that's one of the things that we're really hoping people understand from today's event is, there's nothing remotely, melodramatic about hate crime, the way people sometimes frame it. It's actually quite the opposite. If anything, people are suffering these huge crimes and they don't look bad when you look at the cold statistics. So it's really, really important that police and other recording bodies are able to show what's actually happening in the communities affected by this. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for that. And thank you, Nikki and Michael and Daniel as well. I'm going to open the floor to questions now, although there is one in the chat. So if you want to get started, this is probably more aimed at Daniel than anybody else. But I'm going to ask this question from a person who was attending earlier and had to leave and go to a different event. It was about what opportunities are open for us to progress legislation around hate crime. You mentioned, Daniel, that we don't have a justice minister, we don't even have a government really at the moment. So where are we if we don't get a government back, and if we don't get ministers back, and what's the opportunity for moving towards direct rule from Westminster, or to even lobby Westminster to do some of this on our behalf? Is that an option?
Okay, I mean, I suppose the first thing is, I suppose we've got the existing legislation, and trying to make it work better is still through hate crimes advocates and everything is still very much a practical way that this could be utilized. The legislation needs to be improved, but it's not as if there's nothing there at the moment. There are provisions there that can be used both on the incitement to hatred stuff and the aggravated sentences piece. In terms of getting improved legislation, I mean, it's very difficult without a without the executive and legislature being in place, and it's even going to be difficult when it is in place. We're going to have to fight and battle for this. There is still an ongoing consultation. So the Department of Justice is about to open a second stage of consultation into next year that people can input their views into, can push for the extension of protected grounds, can push on the issue of different models. So there is still a process there. I don't foresee a movement towards direct rule, which isn't really provided for in the Good Friday Agreement. It was used for a while. You could still get some moves from backbenches as some of this stuff does engage like human rights treaty obligations and things like that. But it's still really a long shot. I would say we might have to work with what we have at the present moment.
Yeah, that's kind of what I anticipated. It's not a great picture at the moment, but I suppose that's the case for a great deal of legislation that we need progressed. Everything's kind of sitting, waiting in the wings. And with any luck, we'll get the government back before too long. But I'll open the floor now. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody here in the audience? You can raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself and ask if you want. Okay. There doesn't seem to be any, so that's great, I suppose. I'll finish up now, but I want to, before I do, I want to thank Daniel, Rebecca, Nikki, and Michael for your contributions today, and also your contributions to this field and to the work in general, the stuff that doesn't get recorded and doesn't get on a Human Rights Festival event, and that's happening quiet levels of communities all across this place and all of the time. Thank you so much. You are very much appreciated. And we'll continue at the Women's Policy Group to do what we can to promote your work and the importance of it, and to work alongside you anytime we can. Thank you all very much. I'm going to stop recording now, and this will be available soon.